Good afternoon. My name is Uta Peuge, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern. And it's a great pleasure to welcome those of you in the room, in this beautiful room today, to our conversation, as well as all of you who are joining us remotely from throughout the Northeastern Global Campus Network. It's really an honor to give a welcome to this conversation, which is part of Northeastern's network event series called Asia, America, and the World. And in that context, it's a particular honor to thank Philip Tai, Director of the Asian Studies Program at Northeastern, as well as many staff members, and let me just name a few of them, who have supported us in bringing this series to fruition. Philip also organized the series in consultation with students and colleagues, and we are really, really honored to have Junn as our speaker this afternoon. Philip will introduce her in more detail to you in just a minute. So let me thank members of the team that have been so important in bringing this together. Mika Morikawa, our student co-op, Ezra Acevedo, Gabby Fiorenza, and Jen Grieve, and then many others who have collaborated on this. The Asia, America, and the World series really raises important questions about culture, about history, and politics. It is, as you know from the program, about the issues confronting Asian Americans today. And it is also at the same time about the broader state of neighborly relations and even about the state of democracy. And I believe firmly that we will get much food for thought today in order to continue our conversations about how to come to terms and how to fight racism, but also conversations about what it means to be Asian American in today's world. And again, it's a great honor to say welcome to all of you, and I very much look forward to our speaker, to the discussion, and to the questions that you in the audience and those of you who are online as well will ask during those discussions as well. So without further ado, I then want to turn the microphone over to Philip Tai, who will introduce our speaker and the conversation that we are having today with Junn. Philip, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Peuge, for your words of support. We have a great presentation today. Our speaker is going to survey the terrain of Asian American politics and review recent developments in Asian American political behavior. It is sometimes very tempting to view Asian American and Pacific Islanders as this sort of monolithic social or political bloc. But our speaker today will provide some much needed insights and nuance into disaggregating the AAPI community and better appreciate its diversity and its contradictions. I want to echo Dean Peuge's thanks to the many institutions and individuals who made this event and series possible. I'd like to thank the Office of the Provost, the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, as well as co-sponsorship from the Humanities Center. I also want to thank the Political Science Department, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Program for co-hosting our speaker, Vice Provost Phil He and Dean Peuge for their ongoing support. And as always, I want to thank the many people who did the hard work to make this event possible. Mika Morikawa Joe, Ezra Azevedo, Gabby Fiorenza, especially Jen Grieve, the marketing and communications team of Mike Farah, Najima Hollis-Huggins, Megan Donovan, Rachel Mu and her staff and students at the Asian American Center. Thank you all very much. And without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Junn is professor of political science at the University of Southern California. She is the author of 5 books on political participation and public opinion in the United States, the most recent of which she co-authored with Natalie Masuoka. The book is The Politics of Belonging, Race, Immigration, and Public Opinion. Professor Junn has published widely on topics including political behavior, racial and ethnic politics, the politics of immigration, gender and politics, and political identity. In her distinguished career, she has served in many positions and garnered numerous accolades, including Vice President of the American Political Science Association, a Fulbright Senior Scholar. The list goes on and on. Her talk today is entitled Amidst Pandemic and Racial Upheaval, Where Asian Americans Fit. Please join me in welcoming Professor Junn.
Thanks, Philip. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you, and hello to the people who are joining us by Zoom. I'm going to begin. I don't have a lot of slides. I'm not a big slide person, but I wanted to give you a little bit of data. Oh, there she is, Sandra Oh. Now, you know who that is, right? So this is Sandra Oh, and I believe she is here protesting. It's kind of a spontaneous thing, right? She's filming the chair. Have you watched it? You're like, no, you're too into Squid Game. But go back and have a look at the chair. I think she's filming this. She's there, I think in Pittsburgh of all places, filming for this. I think it was a Netflix show called The Chair, where she is a professor of English at a liberal arts college or a liberal arts university. But what I wanted to do was begin by thinking about how and when, and I want you to keep thinking about the circumstances under which a racial identification, whether you want to be there or not, drives people into activism, makes people want to mobilize, makes them want to run for office, makes them want to write a letter. So this isn't only a political science event or talk, but it's also about the circumstances under which, whether it's the pandemic or racial upheaval, that we bring ordinary people to a point where they begin to become active in politics. One of the central kind of tropes about Asian Americans in the United States today is that we are inactive, that we just stay quiet, study that AP Calc, and stay out of everything else, right? Probably not true, and I'm imagining not true for those of you who are actually here. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about a number of things. I'm going to give you a little bit of new data for you to chew on and think about. And I very much hope that this is a conversation. I think that is the spirit of this series, Asia, America, and the World. And I hope that that's what we can do. And I believe that the staff have set up a situation where you'll be able to ask questions and to make comments. And I also would like to, at least for those of you who are here, because I'm not monitoring the chat, I think someone else is, if you have a question or you want to ask something in the middle, go ahead, because this is not like a lecture, okay? All right, so there are a number of things that I want to raise today. So I just said it wasn't a lecture, and you're like, this looks like a lecture. But what I want to do is lay out for you in advance just a sense of where we're going to go in the next 30 minutes. So the first thing I want to do is remind us about thinking about Asian Americans or Asians more generally in context. So often it's the case that people like to just only look at their group, right? It's just that group. But that group alone, it doesn't make that much sense. It's like sort of asking somebody, you know, is it, well, I won't make the analogy, but consider instead what I want to talk about is a sociometric approach, right? Everything has to be understood in relative terms. So racial upheaval, where do Asian Americans fit in that? Do we have it as bad as blacks? Are we better off than white? Are we worse off than whites? These are not necessarily invitations to engage in an oppression Olympics, but instead for us to consider at all times where Asian Americans are in relation to others. Now, that is I wouldn't call it a luxury, but it's a position that Asian Americans and Asians in the world have to take, because Asians are not the dominant group, at least not in the United States. White Americans, on the other hand, have long been the default category. You don't have to say, I'm a white American, but someone will say, well, what are you? Well, I'm Asian American. What are you, right? You probably had that conversation, right? You're on a plane and someone will say, no, really, where are you from? And you'll say, well, I'm from Michigan. And they'll say, no, I mean, like, where are you from? So when we think about, in the first case, Asians in US context, I want you to think about not only the positionality of Asians relative to whites and to African Americans in the United States, but also how that racialization of triangulation, so you'll think about racial triangulation, which is a long-standing and important theory in social science, how that affects how we even understand what is the place of Asian Americans amidst pandemic and racial upheaval. I want you then to think systematically about the racial hierarchy. I'm going to keep returning to these points, but I want to lay them out now for you to think about conceptually. And within the context of that, recognize my main argument is this is a very dynamic situation. It isn't one thing. It's not only dynamic and changing as a function of time, so how things were in the 1950s or 60s, or how things are so changing over time, but also by location. So being Asian American in Boston is going to be very different than being Asian American in Los Angeles, for example. So I want you to keep that in mind. And the last thing I want to raise is the idea of political institutions. Boring, right? You're like, political institutions. Political institutions are actually kind of boring, but actually nevertheless really important. So I will give you the example of the United States Census, which is a political institution. Now the census, it's a body, it's got a whole bunch of federal buildings in Washington, many of them are in Maryland, and it's a part of the Department of Commerce. Now why do we have a census? Because it's written into the Constitution that we have a census, a counting of everybody in the United States for every 10 years. We just had one. It actually wasn't that bad, but we just had one, right? It wasn't as bad as everybody thought it was going to be given the circumstances of the pandemic and other political circumstances. Why on the census do we enumerate race? Dig back in there. American Government 101. Why do we enumerate race? So if I were to count everybody in this room in the old days, so like in 1900, I would count you and I would just mark you what you were. Why did we have to put race down? What's the original reason? Yes?
Making laws to discriminate. Well, there used to be laws, and still are to some extent, that discriminate based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Like a tool for discrimination.
Good. And the main reason for that is in what? Reapportionment or apportionment. Apportionment was based on how many people were in which locations. So southern states had huge populations. Does anybody remember what that compromise was called? 3/5, exactly. 3/5 of what? You would count only 3/5 of the population of, they never called them slaves, but they were not free people, right? We're talking about African slaves in the United States. So that compromise, that requirement in the Constitution to only count 3/5 of Alabama's population, Georgia's population, South Carolina, only three, so they wouldn't give too many representatives to southern states. Therein lies the political institution and the requirement for the census. That then takes us back to the census. Let me also just stay for a minute. How many people in here have Asian Indian descent? We got anybody? All right. So in 1960, you became Asian American. In 1950, you were other. In 1930 and 20, I believe you were white. And in 1910, you were coded by the federal government of the United States of America in the racial taxonomy as Hindu. You're thinking, wait a second, I'm not even Hindu. But at the same, it didn't matter, right? Jews, as we discussed earlier, Jews were also enumerated by the United States government as Hebrew for a brief period of time. And so even though political institutions might seem these things that are hard to penetrate, where there's all these, points at which you end up, not getting anywhere, they also provide multiple access points, because now, as you know, in the census, you can be more than one race, which I am sure just about everybody in this room is, if race itself was less than a fictive concept, which we don't have time for today, but it is. All right, so that's the first thing. I want you to think about Asians in context. And that's hard to do, but it's not hard to do, because if you're Asian, you've always had to think about yourself that way, right? The second thing I want to raise is something that Dr. Tai talked about, and that is the internal heterogeneity. I think we have a lot of, I'm just looking into the room, we have a lot of Asian national origins present here, but you are all lumped together. By the way, in the prior census to 2020, Asians were separated by the federal government as recently as 2010 as separate race. So I'm Korean. How many other Koreans in here? Got any Koreans? Okay. You and I are the same race. How many Chinese? You guys are the same race, according to the government. Japanese. Okay, only you two. Filipino. Vietnamese. Okay, this is not LA, or this is not Long Beach, but nevertheless, each one of those, according to the government, are separate racial groups. Why and how is that? Well, it's what the United States government decided a long time ago. Why would we want to have enumerated Chinese and Japanese in the 1840s and 50s? Just because we felt like it? Yes?
The whole railroad workers getting pissed that immigrants were coming and taking their jobs, kind of exclusion stuff, unless I'm thinking of the 1940s and 50s.
So that would be the 1840s and 50s, but you're on the right track, yes. Japanese internment, well, it's pretty easy to find people if you're in the census coded as Japanese, right? But the reason that the United States government decides to call Japanese and Chinese separate races is so they could find out where they were. Because at that time, the United States has federal immigration policies that bar Asians from entering the United States and being in the United States and holding property, et cetera. So there are reasons why we have these. So those are long-standing legacies that are related to political institutions, but that also demonstrate Asians are not a monolith. So I'm going to give you a little bit of data on that. I also want you to question and think about, what does it mean to be Filipino? Does that mean you have some kind of like one certain way of thinking about the world? You have a lot in common, but you're not necessarily politically one way because you're Filipino. So instead, when we think about Asian American diversity, we shouldn't only think about it in terms of national origin, but there's class, there's education, there's generation of migration as well. So there are many different things. So when people say like, oh, Asians, they're like this, you know, like you drive terrible and you're a bad tipper, right? All the, you know, kind of silly, but nevertheless negative stereotypes. There's a whole lot of variation inside of that. All right. Third, Asian exclusion. We need to keep the history of the experience of Asian Americans in mind as we consider, because I'm going to ask you to think about where do Asian Americans fit today as in pandemic and racial upheaval. And I'm going to give you a little bit of data just to start you thinking about it. There are political consequences of this racialization. So this is the third point. And those political consequences result in long-standing stereotypes. Some may be positive, a lot negative. Racialized tropes. They result in discrimination. They result also significantly in internalized racism that you may feel as a function of those. You try hard not to, but when society provides a whole lot of discriminatory claims as well as stereotypes, internalized racism can also be a result of this, in this case, Asian exclusion and racialization. It can also have a positive side, which is, of course, what we're experiencing right now. And I think one of the reasons I'm standing here today is mobilization on the part of students on this campus. Not the only reason, but one reason, right? So let's think about Asian exclusion. And then last, in the takeaways, I want you to think about Asian American politics. Be relational, be sociometric, right? Think also about disaggregating. Don't lump everybody together because you know that's not accurate. We need to think about what's happening within the context of global capitalism. There's just a lot of stuff I can't get into today, but I'm going to ask you this in a moment, but the demand for labor in the United States is very different in the 1840s and 50s, and then the Continental Railroad, Transcontinental Railroad is built. The last spike is driven at Promontory Point. We're connected. We don't need the laborers anymore, right? So keep thinking this is not just what happens to individuals. Individuals are racist or discriminatory. There are structural reasons why this is happening as well. And then finally, I just want to end by thinking about activism. All right, are we good? You're like, that was a long wind up. So let me get you to a little bit of, just a little bit of background information. You already know this if you've taken courses in the history department or in the political science department, which I encourage you to do so. You'll know that there is a long history of context of racialization. So I don't need to, when people put stuff on the screen, I'm like, don't read the stuff that's on the screen, you can read it. But I want you to see that there are plenty of examples. It's not just Asian discrimination or racialization, but do keep in mind that Asians are the only group of Americans who are defined explicitly in federal immigration law to be excluded. So in fact, it's not until 1952 with the McCarran-Walter Act that Asians are allowed to become naturalized citizens again. And it is only the year after that, my father arrives in the United States and can eventually become a naturalized citizen because of this. Prior to that, we have almost 100 years of Asian exclusion in all ways. Filipinos are first colonized by the United States, then given citizenship for a while, and then considered aliens once again with the Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934. So we're talking about a long history of exclusion, and the one group racially in the excluded act. So it's not as if the United States was great with Italians and they weren't great with Mexicans or Africans, but it's never in federal immigration law. You also want to think about all of the Chinese exclusion cases. If you're taking law courses, if you're studying immigration politics today, all of those cases, many of them derive from the Chinese exclusion cases and the concept of citizenship. So think about that background. Now, does anybody know what the term, it's a derisive term. It's called a coolie. Does anybody know what that means?
Doctor.
It's been so long, hasn't it? So coolie, I believe someone helped me with this. Can you help me with this? I think it is a loose translation of, is it in Hindi? A term for a day laborer. So more than 100 years ago, Asians were the day laborers. So today's equivalent of the person who stands on the street and waits for work, to be picked up for work. Now, Asians are also still doing that today too. This is just a cartoon from the 1860s. That's Uncle Sam kicking out the coolie. And now, and it's derisive, but at the same time, if this has happened to Asians with this racialized negativity, how is it that Asians go from being coolie to model minority? How does that happen? Now, I'm not going to give it away because I have an article called that, From Coolie to Model Minority. So you can read that. But if it just as a shortcut, I'll simply say that what happens is immigration policy changes, right? Immigration policy changes. Asians, people from all over the world are allowed into the United States, mostly on occupational certification, H-1B visas. Any of you immigrants or have immigrant parents, you know what an H-1B visa is, right? As a result, I mean, maybe your dean came in on an H-1B visa, and she did. So she came as a student and eventually had to convert to an H-1B visa, which is an occupational preference. So at that time, nobody expected people to come from Asia, but they did. And then they had all of us as kids, and then we brought all of our families. And that's why we see the United States population today being about 6% Asian American. It's why we see Asian American voters becoming critical swing voters in places like Florida, almost, places like Virginia, and recently Georgia. 2 Senate specials recently. All right, so this is just a picture of one of the books I wrote, but it's based on the very first study of Asian Americans, the national study. You think, what, 2008? You didn't have a national survey of Asian Americans? We didn't until 2008. And what happened was we finally got enough money. It was awful, raising that much money. Can you imagine doing interviews with almost 6,000 Asian Americans in language? Because about 70% of Asian American adults speak a language other than English as a first language. So we had to do it in Mandarin and Cantonese and Vietnamese and Tagalog. That's the only dialect we did. We used Hindi, we did Korean. It was a nightmare in terms of translation, but it had to be done. Otherwise, we couldn't know what voters actually thought. So this was the first time it was done in 2008, which is annoying, right? Like, why did it take so long to do this? In part, it's because all of the reasons I talked about at the beginning. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of data to chew on. I love data because I'm a political scientist. So we have data from 2020. This is relatively recent from the UCLA Comparative Multiracial Post-Election Survey. And what I'm providing for you here is a comparison. So this is an example of how a sociometric or relational analysis would be done. And it shows you the proportion of people within each big four racial category of who they supported, who they voted for in the 2020 election. What's the most, give me one really obvious thing that you see in the data. Yes?
Most whites voted for Trump.
Most whites voted for Trump. We're not surprised, right? Because we knew that already. But it's a lot. It's 52%. And they're the one group that votes majority for Trump. And we know that African Americans are heavily Democratic, right? And we also think that Latinos are heavily Democratic, but so are Asian Americans, right? So the thing that you'll see is just that. The majority of voters are going, in this case, voters of color are not supporting Republicans in a majority. So that doesn't mean that all minorities are the same, all non-whites are the same, but that in fact, so Asian Americans are further away from whites, at least in terms of voting preferences. At the same time, there's 26% of Asian Americans who voted Republican. I'll bet you know some, right? Your parents, your aunties, your friends, maybe you. It's not a large amount, but it's still among the largest of the non-white minority populations. So I also want to give you a sense of some of the internal diversity. So when you look, did you find your group yet? You got your people down here? So mine are 67-23, so I'm Korean American. And who's the biggest? Who's the biggest set of supporters of President Biden? Asian Indians, who are, by the way, the most recent, the largest group and the biggest group of the most recent immigrants. They come in mainly in the 90s and beyond. But also other, which is just a big category of anybody else who we didn't have large enough groups for. Who are the biggest Trump supporters, relatively speaking? Because remember, all Asian Americans, it was 26. Who are they? Someone tell me. Yes?
Filipino Americans, Taiwanese Americans, and Vietnamese Americans?
Does that make sense? What makes you think that? Let's start with Filipinos. What accounts for higher Trump support among Filipinos? There's no one right answer. What are you thinking?
So based on my interactions with one of my closest friends who is Filipino, there's a lot of religious conservatism there.
Okay. Religious conservatism, meaning Catholicism, meaning anti-abortion in many cases, or generally speaking, social conservatism, which could, today's Republican Party, you got to wonder about that, but nevertheless associated with more conservatism. What's your hypothesis for, I actually don't know the answer for Taiwanese, yes? Say again?
From my experience talking to my grandparents, I think the people who live here from Taiwan, they kind of immigrated after the Chinese had come into Taiwan. So they saw the difference between Japan and Chinese rule. And when the Chinese came, they actually ended up sort of upheaving the entire Taiwanese economy. They were also extremely, you essentially couldn't associate yourself with anyone who was mainland Chinese at the time, because if you were seen as being communist, you would be deported or you would be killed. And so I think for them, it's like a very negative association. And so they are really pro any policies that are capitalistic. And so that's kind of like why I think they tend to vote that way.
And you hit on it, I think, in the same explanation that you might find for Vietnamese, who also have a stronger Catholic tradition as a function of who colonized them? Who colonized Vietnam? The French, which is why you get Lee's sandwiches, right? You get those really great Vietnamese sandwiches on French bread, right? That comes from French colonization. But at the same time, Catholicism, but anti-communism, right? Because most of the Vietnamese who leave Vietnam are leaving during the time in which Vietnam falls to communist rule. So remember that there's internal variation And we can explain what that variation is. That's what our job is as scholars and as informed citizens, try to understand why we see these patterns. All right, so I'm just gonna get moving because I think we're about out of time. I do want you to think a bit about how it is that racial hierarchy and your positionality, whatever racial group you see yourself in, and how it is that it changes how we think about not only ourselves, but how we interpret other happenings in politics, whether it's the political attitudes you hold, the parties you decide to support, and the people you want to vote for. I think in many ways, politics, and this is the last bullet point there, is interpreted through a racial prism. People see one thing coming in, but it ends up reflecting out in a very different way. So when we see the murders in Atlanta, it affects us in a way, if you share that racial group identity, that it doesn't affect others. If you are a black person and you watch George Floyd being murdered in front of your eyes, it affects all of us, but it may affect African Americans in a different way. And so I think it's useful to always, I know this is the famous LP cover, right? But stop, and as the best thing I could find, it's copyrighted though, of course, so I couldn't put it in our book. But think of it as the white light coming in. This is Dark Side of the Moon. You know, does anybody still listen to it? I heard that, like, I read somewhere that somewhere in the world, the Dark Side of the Moon is playing continuously. Like, someplace in the world, you'll hear that Pink Floyd album. A stimulus comes in, and depending on where you are in racial hierarchy, you're going to see things in a very different way. And the rainbow is a beautiful thing, right? This is just a refractive prism. I don't know that those guys in Pink Floyd knew, maybe they were, they had like a nice hallucinogenic drug and then decided to make this cover. But in any case, think about it as the way everything, people will say, well, I don't see it that way. And you'll say, well, actually that violence was really important and it affected you in a way because you share that racial identity, because you understand the context, because you sense what it means. So we should not think of public opinion as just being one thing. We should think of it as being refracted off of something like racial categorization that is deeply embedded into American institutions. Let me just give you one more example. This is scary to anyone, right? So imagine this is in your rearview mirror. And I think I talked about this earlier. But when you see this, everybody's heart goes a little faster, right? Because you're like, oh no, right? Same stimulus. But if you're Sandra Bland, do you remember Sandra Bland? What happened to Sandra Bland? Is she alive today? She's not alive. She was pulled over for a traffic violation, brought to a jail, I think in Texas, right? I can't remember the name of the town, and she died in custody. No one really knows exactly what happened. And you can't really see this, but this is a picture of an officer pulling over a woman, and he's giving her ice cream because it's ice cream day. Now, these are two very different ways of thinking about this same treatment. When you see that in your rearview mirror, as a, middle-aged Asian woman, I'm afraid because I don't want my insurance to go up, but I do not fear that my life is in danger. I don't, because it's probably not going to happen to me. So the same heat that melts the butter in one case will also harden the egg. That same stimulus has two very different effects on people. And the outcome to politics and the outcome to mobilization is very different. So this is a particularly scary example, but I think if you are a dark-skinned person and you are a man, this in your rearview mirror means your life could be in danger. So think about how a homogeneous treatment, just seeing the cop's lights in your rearview mirror, can have a highly heterogeneous effect depending on what body you just happen to be in. Oops. And I think I've come close to the end of my time, and I hope that we'll have more time to discuss this. I think that where I'd like to end is for us to be thinking about how it is that our own social identities, our own reactions to political events, our own sense of what it is that we can do together, either in opposition to what's happening in government or in conjunction to making things better is a function of not only just in the moment events that are happening, but a long legacy of racialized contexts in which Americans and Asians across the board have been put into. So I've left you with a couple of images. One, of course, on the right are protesters who have a sign indicating that when Black lives are threatened, all lives are threatened. I think that it's important for us to keep in mind, whether you're Asian American or not, that in fact, we are all connected, right? And that we don't have the luxury of saying, it's not my problem. When Asian Americans look to or consider their own privilege, because we are privileged in some ways. I'm privileged as an Asian woman. I'm probably not going to get, I mean, you never know, right? This is Boston, right? Like, you never know. Like, I could get pulled over and shot. Probably, I'm just joking. I mean, probably not. But the point is that our privilege is also the source of propping up, in many ways, the source of anti-Blackness. I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. That should be a central element of how we understand where Asian Americans fit amidst racial upheaval as well as pandemic. Also, I don't know if you can really see her. Do you remember this one? This was, I think, shortly after the inauguration. There was this, she's in purple. She's, you know, she's an older lady. We would call her an auntie, right? And she is protesting. Protesting isn't only, and political activism is definitely, hopefully, something that you will do, be involved, make change, but it's also something that before us, all the people that came before us, and that's not just Asian Americans or Latinx people, or even in many cases, civil rights workers and advocates who were white, asking for social change for so long, but really African American political activists that paved the way. Were it not for them, I wouldn't be here. Probably many of you wouldn't be here. So I think I'd like to end by thinking about the promise of what it is that America and Asians have for making the world, I hope, a more egalitarian and I think a more humane place. So I'll end with that, and I welcome your questions. Hello.
Thank you very much, Professor Junn, for that very stimulating talk. It raises very many questions, and I appreciate the fact that you were able to disaggregate the category of Asian Americans and highlight the internal diversity of that category. I guess I'll go ahead and lead off with a few questions before the audience can ask their question. Whether you are here or online, please do not hesitate to ask our honored speaker any kind of questions you might have. Well, Professor Junn, let me go ahead and just ask you. You gave us a picture, a sense of where Asian Americans, in terms of their overall voting patterns. I'd like to ask, how did the pandemic, how did the protests, from last year, how did all that change, if at all, any sort of political behavior or political thinking of this very broad category? Again, I hesitate to ask you to generalize, but if you can maybe elucidate some changes that you might have sensed or detected, that would be great.
Well, I think it's kind of early to say, but I'll offer some hypotheses. One of them would be, this is like the most boring one first, but Asian Americans are the most likely to vote absentee by mail. Right? In California, everybody votes, at least our most recent election for the recall of Governor Newsom, which failed. We all voted by mail. Oregon now votes totally by mail. I don't know what Massachusetts it's like, but Asian Americans are the most likely to vote by absentee ballot. And when you have a circumstance like the pandemic where voting was allowed to be dropped off or or not necessarily in person, but mailed in. My sense is that rates of voting among Asian Americans has increased. Voting by mail also allows, I don't know if any of you have this experience, do you help your parents with stuff in English? So when you get a bill, or like your tuition bill, or when the electricity bill comes and there's something wrong with it, you're the one that calls. I mean, that's a sort of a classic thing that the children of immigrants do, socializing to politics rather from parent to child, from children to parents. It's a very important role that people play, particularly in the context of misinformation that may be coming through ethnic media sources. You're probably familiar with what I speak of. So I think one of the first things that's happened in the pandemic, and I would bring this to the pandemic mostly, is a requirement, or not the requirement, but the more openness to how voting actually occurs. And when you provide people with more opportunities, longer time to turn the ballot in, being able to drop off, being able to be at home, to have someone help. Obviously, in the Voting Rights Act, we do, I think it's Section 206, correct me if I'm wrong, political scientist, I think it's Section 206 of the Voting Rights Act, which is for language minorities. But you may not have a big enough size of population. Like we have, I think, the largest Khmer speaking population in Long Beach,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so there are ballots written in Khmer for voters, but probably not in most places. So I would say the first thing, it's kind of a boring one, but actually it makes a difference. How many votes did Raphael Warnock and Joel, forgetting his name, the other senator from Georgia win by? It was tight in Georgia, right? What's his name? Joel.
John Ossoff.
John Ossoff, thank you. Record mobilization of Asian American voters. And part of that's possible because people are sitting around able to make calls, able to, if not actually go into people's houses, to provide mobilization. So I would say that the extra time that voters had and the capacity to mobilize helped Asian American turnout. One thing that's really clear is that Asian Americans are more democratic this time than times before. So Asian Americans used to be thought of as sort of like a 50-50. This was back in the 70s and 80s. Korean Americans were like super Republican back then. And what's happened is not only has politics changed, but the population has changed as well. So more highly educated Asian Americans, they're just more democratic. So as the population becomes more democratic, it's not true for everybody. I mean, highly educated whites are not necessarily more democratic. But minority populations, the more highly educated people are, at least among Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans, higher rate of democratic voting. And that is the case here as well. So we could compare this election back to 16, back to 12, and 08. That's as long as we have good data for. And even in 08, we didn't have good exit poll data. But Asian Americans are becoming more democratic. Now, is that a function of the racial upheaval? Is it because Biden hasn't actually been great on progressive issues, like on police reform, et cetera. Nevertheless, what's the alternative? So I would say that the other thing besides mobilization and the turnout is a small move toward democratic voting. So it's supportive Democratic candidates, rather. You see this not only in the federal election, I think you'll probably see it again in 22 in the midterms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Junn. Before perhaps we take some questions, let me ask one more question. This is a question that formed in my head during a previous conversation that we had, which was an important issue for many Asian Americans, and that is the issue of affirmative action, which you just said that the overall voting population of Asian Americans is trending more democratic, but that does not necessarily mean that all their political positions are uniformly liberal or progressive. And I believe in a previous conversation you mentioned affirmative action being just that issue. So I'd love to hear you elaborate on that.
Right. So of course you're all aware of the fact that other institutions, one just right down the road, is being sued for its policies on race-conscious admissions, that would be Harvard, and it remains to be seen what happens in that case. But Asian Americans, here's an example of an issue where I just looked at the data, and I didn't put it up there because there was just like too much of it. But if you're interested, write to me, and then I can send it along to one of your professors, and you can look at it in detail, because there's actually quite a lot of good variation even between the ethnic national origin groups, where support for issues such as a path to citizenship, for abortion, other like social and economic issues, is, relatively speaking, democratic or progressive. What you see on affirmative action is not. So you see more, I don't want to say conservative positions, but more anti-affirmative action positions among Asian Americans. And it really depends. It divides some by national origin group. It's actually well-educated people are systematically less in favor of, among Asian Americans, systematically less in favor of affirmative action. So it's an example of how cross-cutting many of the issues are for Asian Americans, even within group.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Do we have any questions online? Oh. Do we have any questions?
Okay, so if we want to start on the question and answer, we have a microphone right here for folks, if folks want to line up. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for your talk. I'm Claire, and I was wondering, when you were doing the national review, just kind of like surveying like those 6,000 Asian Americans, besides like talking to them in their native language, how else did you try to make them feel comfortable enough so that they would speak to you? I know that an issue with surveying is that a lot of times people will just hear something and then hang up the phone or not really give like their full honest answers. So I was just kind of wondering how you went about trying to get those full honest answers.
Well, Claire, that's a very good question. Survey methodology, it is not easy, right? And it's not easy when you just have somebody kind of cold call you. And that is exactly what happens. I mean, have you hung up on someone? I know I have. And we do a couple of things. First, that's why we had to do it in language, because you may be perfectly good at speaking English or hearing English, and most people are better at another language listening to it rather than speaking it. And it's, your mom says like, I don't speak, and but like we speak at home all the time, but you still don't feel comfortable enough to do it. So we had in language and co-ethnics for each of the. So we didn't have. Well, actually, I don't know that the person could tell, but we had only co-ethnics interviewing Koreans or Filipinos. We only did Tagalog, unfortunately, but most Filipinos in the United States have a fair amount of English. So that was the first way. And the second way was with what we would call conversion strategies. So when a person would hang up on you, we'd call them back again with a different interviewer that specialized and was a native speaker in the language and went. So Japanese Americans, for example, there's very little Japanese immigration. It's not to say that there isn't anymore, but most Japanese Americans in the United States are second generation and beyond. So we didn't have that issue with Japanese Americans. There was one group we really tried hard with, and we failed so miserably. It was Hmong. So Hmong don't have a country, but Hmong are famous now because somebody won a gold medal who was Hmong American. I forgot her name. Sunny, or Suni. But the Hmong people don't have a country. They're an ethnic group, I think mostly in Laos and previously in Laos and Cambodia, who cooperated with the United States government during the Vietnam War, and as a result, systematically persecuted and were then allowed to migrate to the United States under refugee status. But the Hmong have never had a country, so there's no place to store their language, and they have no written tradition. It's only an oral tradition. So imagine trying to do that, right? So you have Hmong interviewers, speaking Hmong, reading off a English script. I think we got 2 completed interviews, and it cost us about $10,000 to do those 2. I know, that was a lot. So we had to give up. But other than that, it isn't easy. And I think that what you'll find, probably what you see in these CMPS data that I showed you, they're probably mostly, people more like you, right? And your friends, maybe not your parents, or people more like me who have English as a dominant language. But we do, even in these data, you see that 70% and more of adult Asian Americans are foreign-born. So it's a good question. Where the rubber meets the road is how good is your data? You have to do this. So I wouldn't trust a lot of other surveys of Asian Americans that aren't done in language. So I would be very skeptical whenever you see one ask how many Asian languages did you do the survey in? Because absent that, there's no way to, not no way, but it's very difficult to build trust with a respondent. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a virtual question next and then an in-person.
Hello. We currently actually don't have any questions from the virtual audience. So virtual audience, if you're out there, please ask questions. So this one's from me. My name is Ezra. I know that you're also a scholar of women's and gender studies, and so I was curious as to how that fits into your work with Asian American studies and political science, and how you see that fitting into your research on Asian American political engagement.
That's a great question. Thank you, Ezra. And I was analyzing it this morning very early because I wrote someone and said, give me the data broken down by gender. And what's really, I don't want to call it worrisome. It's just, I don't know what the answer to it is. But I'm very interested in the gender gap. You know what the gender gap is, right? That in the United States, women voters are more likely to support Democratic candidates. Now, when I looked at the CMPS data, that's the UCLA data that's recently out, I see gender gaps among whites. So white women are more Democratic than white men, so they supported Biden more than white men did, even though they still voted majority for Trump. I think the gender gap's about 4%. African American women voters, stalwart of the Democratic Party. They're the reason they're the reason Joe Biden's in there right now. It's a big gender gap, even though African Americans are heavily Democratic. Black women are super Democrats. There's a gender gap for Latinx, where Latinas are more Democratic, but there is none for Asian Americans. So Asian American women voted about the same level as Asian American men for Democrats. They still vote Democratic, but we don't see a gender gap, and this has been consistent for the last 3 election cycles on the presidential level.
Would you like to speculate why?
I wish I was hoping to see one, right? No, that's not an answer. I would expect to see one. Why is it different for this group? Some of the reasons could be relatively recent migration, right? And so women and men may decide together, let's say if they're in a hetero relationship or they're in a family situation, because Asian Americans tend to live in larger households, so there's more people in the household where there may be more interaction, so there'll be less people going in different directions. That's one. I think the other reason is, and I had some other data on it, I didn't bring it, I had tons of data, but the data that I have on, remember earlier we were looking at adherence to traditional gender roles and hostile sexism measures, where what you see are women of color, despite being heavily Democratic, also more heavily than their white female counterparts agree with some of those traditional gender roles, and also are more likely to embrace measures of hostile sexism, like once a woman gets a man to, this is an actual survey question, once a woman gets a man to commit, she puts him on a short leash. Women often misunderstand things men say to them. And what is the reason for that? As we discussed earlier, you would think like, wow, if they're so democratic, why are they more embracing of traditional roles? Why are they more hierarchical? And I think it's because patriarchy invades every space. It's not as if just because you're a person of color, you're like, I smash the patriarchy. Well, probably not. And in many ways, the often more conservative cultures that we associate with, whether it's based in the Catholic religion or other forms of Christianity or Confucian culture and long-standing traditions of, respect for elders, particularly the male leader of the family, democratic voting may occur, but the internalization of patriarchal values is, it's hard to kick, right? You may not want to go there. It's still hard to go around it. So I think that's what I would say. What I don't understand, though, that is also the case for Latinx populations, right? We talk about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is all over Latin America and South America, but we see a gender gap for Latinas. We don't see one for Asian American women. I can't explain it. Somebody, you got a hypothesis? I can test it. We'll come back to that. Okay, that is like what I didn't present it because I didn't know what to make of it. But it's there, and it's consistent now for the last 3 cycles.
I guess.
What's your name?
I'm Avi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Junn. I really appreciate it. Second, before I get to my question, I guess you asked for a hypothesis, so I was thinking of one. It could be that Latinx communities have been here longer, so they're less, I guess, especially when you consider the waves of migration, right? You've got like a huge influx of Asian Americans very recently. So those communities, I'm not sure if there would be a way to separately examine, but it could be that those communities that came here recently were those sort of like 2 partners in a relationship who came here as a family, something like that, as opposed to, I guess, people who've grown up here who, sure, still have live in majority Latinx communities, but have still grown up in this environment. And so, I guess, for example, my parents, they have some really conservative views, but they'll still vote Democrats because their entire voting pretty much is Republicans are racist. That's, or at least this election cycle it was. So I suppose it could be or not just racist, but anti-immigrant is one thing. So it could be that more Asian Americans who are citizens are recent immigrants, perhaps?
You are correct. And I think we could, the one place where you could see a gender gap is Japanese Americans. That small group, because they have been in the United States a long time. So we're not talking, that's a good hypothesis. And by the way, do you think that most Latinx people are immigrants like Asian Americans, or are they mostly citizens? Are they mostly citizens or non-citizens or born in the U.S.? Citizens, born in the United States. Most are native born. It's a pretty even split, but so you are probably correct that because what's happened to migration from Latin America, at least migration that's been authorized and documented, it's slowed down tremendously, certainly during the Trump years, and then even before then with migration policy. But Asian immigration to the United States has continued because it's legal migration in the sense that it's still H-1B visas, which is the majority of where Indian migration happens in the 1990s, and also because of family reunification. So that's a good hypothesis. I'm going to check it. Thank you.
And then I guess my actual question. So I've been thinking about this for a few months because I sort of realized over the pandemic, especially when sort of the identity of Asian American was sort of I guess brought into the mainstream a lot more due to obviously the uptick in racism as well as other factors. And I think one of the things I've been wondering, and you talked about this in your speech, was how obviously different Asian American groups behave very differently and have very different influences. So I'm an Indian American, right? And the stuff that influences, say, my parents and to less of an extent, but still to an extent me to vote a certain way or behave a certain way, or the issues facing me would be very different from, say, someone who's Vietnamese American. So I'm wondering, do you still think the broader label of Asian American is a category that should exist given how many individual, I guess, very, very different groups exist under that umbrella? And if so, what do you think the purpose I guess, how do you think it's a useful, and also more broadly, Asian American Pacific Islander as a term? It's, the Pacific Islanders are like just a completely different group who often aren't represented despite that being in the overall thing. But do you think that, I guess, so coming back to my question, sorry, this is a bit of a brain dump, but
it's good. Keep going.
I guess, is the category useful, and if it is, and how do you see it as an analysis tool as well as just a broader, I guess, way to understand the world? Do you think so is it useful, and if so, where are its limitations?
Well, that's a great question. And guess what? I sometimes ask that as an exam question because people are like, why are you so obsessed with race? I'm like, I wouldn't be so obsessed with race if you weren't so obsessed with race. Like, why is the whole country obsessed with race? And I think part of it goes to the whole country is founded on racial subjugation. That is in our founding document. It's part of our creed, if you will, unfortunately. So we can't walk away from it. And there are always two sides to this. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could just like erase everybody's brain and say like race is gone, and we just use something like signs of the zodiac instead, right? How many Virgos in this room? Virgos are the best, right? But then Aries will be like, no, we're the best, and Taurus will say, no, we're the best, and Scorpions, we don't. Everybody knows, like, it's one of those things that when you meet a roommate or you meet friends or you meet a significant other, you're like, I got to check the Cosmo bedside astrologer to see if we're a match or not. But we don't do anything in politics on it because there's no power associated with it. If we could erase race categories and power, I would love it. Like, could we count the people with sandals on versus sneakers? Would it make a difference? It wouldn't, because it's not related to power. So as much as I'd like to get rid of it, unless we could really erase everybody's mind and it wasn't important anymore, race categories are there because they protect us as well. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a number of provisions in it. Let's just take 7, for example. That's Title 7, which is among the most important, discrimination in employment and other places. You have to have racial categories in order to enforce it. You have to have categorization in order to demonstrate evidence in court and to create policies such as affirmative action and fair housing that allow for the undoing of the original sin of race in the United States. So as much as I would like to get rid of it, I would like to go back in time and not have the slave trade. I would like to go back in time and not have coolies and the exploitation of all people with the justification made on the basis of race. But if we can't do that, I think we have to use them to the benefit of changing the structures and making systems more egalitarian. And this leads to my answer to your question on Asians. I mean, like, white people are diverse, right? Totally. In 100 years ago, in this very town, Irish, Italians, Jews, they were not white. They were less than white. They only eventually become white over the course of time, right? You know that if you've taken courses in cultural studies or in ethnic studies, you would know that. And yet at the same time, they're not a monolith either. But in politics, and if as a group, it doesn't, to me, once we've been categorized this way, if someone's discriminating against you, that's my problem too. And so I think that it's not my problem, it's my task to join together. And it is the same way that when there is, let's say, police brutality to the extent that we saw, that's our job too. It's our job to dismantle that. It's our job. So it doesn't have to be only Asian. It's an artifice. It's a pure fictive thing of what these categories are, but they exist. And so in my opinion, you're absolutely right that on the one hand, it's absurd, right? But at the same time, we have to be realistic about how it is that change occurs. Change has to occur through mobilization and through group action. And so I think for the time being, I'm all for it. I think you're absolutely right about Pacific Islanders. By the way, this study also has a sample of Native Hawaiians, actually. Man, that was difficult too, except that it was in Hawaii. That would have been great to go to do those interviews and supervise the interviews there. But they're completely different. Pacific Islanders, and that's not just Hawaii, it's Chamorro and Samoa, Tonga. Why are these in the Asian category? But they are. They're geographically in the Asian. It's for, like, New Zealand and Australia should probably be in the Asian category too, but they're not for other reasons. So, yeah, it's not really useful analytically, like as a true like dividing up of people. But what it is useful for is as a political strategizing group consciousness tool for helping to working to dismantle inequality. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for answering my question.
Hello. I have a question from the virtual audience. This one comes from Risa Kitagawa. Asians in the U.S. are often stereotyped as being politically apathetic. But recent events like the violence against Asian women in Atlanta last year have spurred more public conversations both within and beyond the AAPI community around Asian hate. Can we expect to see these public conversations translating into political participation or into greater voter participation among different groups?
That's a good question. I think, it's hard to say because events such as the murders of these women in Atlanta, they are unfortunately common. They're more common than we know. They just don't get the news all the time. I mean, there are plenty of murders, probably racially motivated, ethnically motivated, that are not mass murders, but it doesn't mean that people haven't been killed for that reason. I would like to think that it's a catalyzing event for the moment, but I also think that what it does is it, in combination with everybody being home and everybody being attuned and everybody already feeling the urgency of the moment with respect to racial upheaval, I do think that it could be the basis certainly for a generation of people to better understand how it is. It's not as if, your greatest violence against the Asian Americans, you get a B- on the calculus test, right? And instead, it is much bigger and broader than that. And I think that it's a specific and a particular moment. I'm not sure. It's hard to say what any one moment will do. I mean, I was coming from the airport and there was a big billboard, and it was one of the students who was murdered at Parkland. Have you seen it? Oh man, it's right. It's arresting as it's meant to be. And it said he couldn't vote because he's dead. And I would like to think that, and there was just another school shooting, and people are like, nobody died. There was still, did you have drills? Did you have active shooter drills? My kids have active shooter drills in high school. That's what we don't have earthquake drills anymore because everybody knows what to do. But they've got active shooter drills for elementary school students. Because don't forget, there was this it was President, at the time was Obama. What was the name of the town in Connecticut? Where all those little children were murdered. Have any of our laws on firearms control changed in any systematic way? Some, but not to a significant degree. We do not have federal bans against assault rifles and assault weapons, semi-automatic weapons. So I would like to think, Risa, that this is an important moment. And I would like to, it is an important moment that has political consequences. I think it remains to be seen. And I think it is up to all of us to do something about it. But I do think that in particular, powerful lobbies, let's say, I'll just give you the example of gun lobbies. It's hard to beat them. It's almost as hard to beat them as opioid manufacturers. So this is what I mean about the overlay of, the capitalist system and the connections that those corporations have to legislatures and lawmaking bodies and policy arenas. So I hope so, but I think we got to be realistic. It just tells you how high the bar is and how tough the task is for us. Thanks for the question.
Hi, my name's Eva. I just had a question that built upon one of the previous ones asked. How do you deal with the category of other in your research, if at all? I'm not Asian, but I am mixed race, and a lot of my friends who are like mixed with Asian, we all kind of opt to put down other, or you put down white, or you put down something else in order to avoid the discrimination that comes with being labeled, like as Asian American or as Latino when we're doing academics or healthcare or whatever it is. So I was kind of wondering, like, how do you address that in your research? Because maybe that's where the missing data points are, because like we're kind of like a group that doesn't get addressed or included in these discussions because we choose to identify ourselves as a different way.
So that is a super important question, and the concept of multi-race or multiracial, I mean, obviously you've been able to do it since 2000 on the US Census. My colleague Natalie Masawoka has a whole book on multiracials, and it really depends on your combo, right? In California, we would call mixed race kids Hapa, and both of my children are well, it was with the same guy, so they're both Hapa. They're mixed race too, and between the two of them, one of them is like, I'm so Asian, and the other one is like, I'm not Asian. I'm kind of Asian, but I'm white too, and it depends also at the time, right? So it's a work in progress as to how people identify themselves and then how they want to be seen or how they're seen. If you change your hair a little bit, you look one thing. You wear different clothes. You style your makeup. I mean, men wear makeup too, but I mean, like mostly, like if you put a different type of makeup on, you can look totally different. And I think that in some ways, that would just be great. Like, I'm never going to be able to be seen as anything but Asian. And it would, like, from my perspective, I think it'd be great. I could change myself every now and then. But not so much. I do think that what it speaks to is that liminal space that we can't, as researchers, we're like, what do we do with them? Let's put them in the other category. We don't know what to do. And I think that now the other category, as you could see, is big, right? I didn't give you the ends, but it's like the third largest category among Asian Americans. So people who are part something, but on the other hand, if you're part black, like when Kamala Harris is running, she's mostly running as a black woman, right? Even though she's both, she's us too, right? She's Indian as well as black. But where does that concept of, where it comes from, right? The hypodescence rule. If you're just a tiny little bit black, you're black. It's very different. So if you're black and Asian, most of the research that we have shows that most people, when we have multiracial research, so look at Natalie Masawoka's work from UCLA. I think it's just called Multiracial Politics in America. That black is the heavier category, that people themselves then choose to identify as black. And when there is white and black together, it depends. When it's Asian and black, it's still black. When it's Asian and white, it's almost 50-50. So I think we just don't understand well enough what the dynamics inside the category are. But you could be right that noise is really what's driving our inability to understand more fully. It's important. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just ask a quick question.
Yes.
I thought the research that you did really interesting about the overabundance of Asian Americans that vote via mail.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, knowing what's happening currently within the political framework to mitigate or minimize the use of mail-in voting, in what ways do you see the Asian American community being proactive, if at all, along with other communities to address this? Because obviously it's a tactic in order to minimize the use of the impact that occurred in 2020 as it related to the voting that occurred either through mail and or through other sources. So I just wanted to see if you could speak to that at all.
No, I think that's right. I mean, and what you see is moves by some parties to reduce the capacity of people to vote, whether it's by mail or in advance or drop-off locations. So Texas and, well, Florida are good examples of locations where there will be further restrictions on this. I think that what you'll see, once you've had a bite, a chance to vote, you begin to establish it as a habit. And I think that over the last several election cycles, as the mechanisms for voting have widened, and Asian Americans have taken advantage of them, and Asian Americans see the stakes, what we're doing is learning from the best mobilizers there are out there. That would be people like Stacey Abrams, whose efforts in the state of Georgia made all the difference. We have a 50-50 Senate now, 50-50 Democrat, Republican, and that's for the efforts on the ground of people like Stacey Abrams and others as well. So I think that Asian Americans will learn from activists in voting rights, in expanding voting rights, and expanding access to voting. I think they will learn. I don't know, it's a tough act to follow, though. Georgia is one heck of a tough act to follow, and what was done in the specials in 20. But any time that someone tries to take away what we've had and what is, I don't want to say given to us, but it's guaranteed to us in the Constitution. I don't think people will stand by for that. I do think it does depend a bit on the Supreme Court, however. If the Supreme Court is just like, that's okay, then we're in bigger trouble, right? All the more reason why it's important to, consider electing presidents that then have the power to appoint judges, and electing senators that then have the power to confirm those judges. Point well taken, it's a structural problem. And when you can't win on the merits, you try to win by disenfranchisement. And I don't think that it's the only strategy available. So I think parties will try it. But I think that they won't be successful if people on the ground refuse. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have 2 more in-person questions, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Lauren. Thank you, Dr. Junn, for coming all the way here today. I have 2 questions for you, and both of them kind of stem off of an event actually held yesterday at Northeastern, which was called The Price of Whiteness, and it featured Professor Eric Goldstein from Emory University, and it was about Jews' place in America. It's kind of a similar question about where Jews fit in. And Professor Goldstein argued that Jews had a particular place or a particular position in fighting anti-Black racism in the U.S. because of their position of success, not only in politics, but in the business world. And I don't mean to internalize any of the model minority myth, but I was wondering, would you say Asian Americans are in any particular place to help fight anti-Black racism in the U.S.? And then my second question, also related to that event, was I tend to see that a lot of Asian American activists are women, and I was wondering why that might be, why more Asian American women might be outspoken, given the patriarchal values that you mentioned earlier, and the lack of a gender gap in their political mobilization. So I was wondering if you could give any insight on that.
Wow, that's a good question. I have flip answers, but I won't give those. Women are better. No, just kidding. No, I think, I'm not sure that there are a lot of, I think that it would be probably more balanced if we looked systematically at activists, and I think maybe the ones out front might be, you may remember them better, but I'm not sure that empirically it's the case that there are more female Asian American activists, though there's some, but let's also remember there are female Asian Americans across the board in Democratic as well as Republican circles. Let's not forget 2 of the most recent members of Congress flipping seats from Democratic to Republican in California, and Orange County in particular, are both Asian American women. So I think it's probably, your dean and I were just talking about this in advance of the talk here, that I think colleges and universities in the United States today are 60-40, with 60% female, 40% male. And what you see are all of those sort of ways people get into politics and organizing happens very much at the ground. Like, you're the soccer mom, you're the one that does the school board stuff. You then become the one that organizes the town council. And then next thing you know, you're running a major campaign. And so I think that some of it has to do with the networks of cooperation that women are traditionally more likely to take part in, though that could be changing as well. So my answer is I'm not sure it's more female, but that if it is, there are explanations in access to higher education and then success in higher education, as well as the likelihood that you're doing a lot of this organizing and training in your community that you don't even think about as politics. The other question of, do Asian Americans have a special place? I don't know that we have a special place, but we have an obligation, just like any American would, or any person, any human being would have, to fight oppression systematically. I think that in the case of Jews have experienced genocide in a way that most populations have not, in recent memory. And it is something that that oppression of that magnitude will forever link the experiences, even if those experiences are nothing, being killed by a police officer are not the same as genocidal experiences. That history and knowledge is embedded in people's understanding of who they are. So I do think that even if that's not a part of your culture or your history, as human beings, all of us should stand in opposition to it. I don't know that Asian Americans have a special place. I think we all do. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Junn. Sorry, I think I'm extending this event longer than it should be.
That's okay.
So I was just wondering if you think that other countries have a say in America's race politics, especially since these days a lot of countries are engaged in exporting culture, like you mentioned Squid Game earlier. So
I haven't watched it yet, but everybody says it's really good.
You should watch it. So I was just wondering if you think that these countries have the responsibility, Asian countries in particular have a responsibility, or any influence, if any,
the influence
to promote Asian culture, and also be careful not to be mindful of any stereotypes or offensiveness that could be present and could be unique to America.
That is such a smart question, and I'm going to use just Korea as an example. I'm imagining with a name like Hyun, are you Korean? Yeah. Okay, so we're the same race, at least according to the census as of 2010. I'm just going to talk about Korea because it's the example that I know best. And who's a fan of K-pop? I admit it, I like it. It's kind of hard not to be, right? But I do think that, there's a lot of some activism. I mean, what was it? Was it like BTS or something that jammed up the reservations to one of the Make America Great rallies or something? People will say, oh, that's just performative. And it may be performative, but it had an effect, right? It had an effect. And it may not be true activism on the ground, people fighting for voting rights. But I think that what you've identified, though, is we, as Americans, we're yeah, it's us. We're influencing the world. But the world is, of course, influencing us as well. And I'm quite sure that style and fashion and culture, in particular in modern Korean pop culture, is affecting. I don't really know anybody who's 25 and under who does not know a fair number of K-pop songs. There's also a lot of soaps or soap operas, like the Korean dramas. Do you watch them? Everybody says you can't understand Squid Game unless you're listening in Korean, which is going to be hard for me. But but I guess we can understand it in the translated way. So I do think, yes, it is, we can't control it because, of course, anti-blackness is exported to Korea by Americans when we don't colonize officially Korea, but the United States has had a long-standing military involvement and occupation in Korea. So some of the anti-blackness that's in Korean culture, where did it come from? It probably came from here to begin with. So the fact that people are thinking, the way you put it, you said something like, should we be mindful of stereotypes? I think absolutely yes. And the fact that you're asking this question tells me that people are thinking about it. So I do think it's important, you're right, to acknowledge the effect of other Asian cultures on American culture. It's not just, I mean, you just think about all the Japanese anime, one of my favorites too, and just there's so much of it, and it's influential. I mean, it's probably flying under the radar of, you know, regular people, but anybody who interacts with 25 and under, it's such a major part of your life, right? Or the games, or so I do think it's important. It's absolutely important, and it speaks to, this is so great you asked this question, because it goes to the theme, Asia, America, and the world. And so it's not a one-way street. This is definitely two ways, and it's a dynamic interaction. So thank you, Hyun.
I just have to interject and say that from a historical perspective, of course, geopolitics plays a role. I mean, that is why the United States has a Chinese Exclusion Act, but not a Japanese Exclusion Act, because of the relative influence of the Japanese Empire versus the Qing Empire. Anyway, that's just my...
we had a gentleman's agreement instead, right? See, you got to take a class with him.
Mika, Morikawa, Joe will make one final announcement before we close this event.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. I wanted to bring your attention to the next speaker in the speaker series, who is Dada Dokot from Purdue University. That event will take place actually entirely online on Thursday, October 28th. We have flyers out there in the front if you want to take some. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now please join me in thanking Professor Junn for her wonderful performance. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.